So fans of the classic film Zulu or Zulu Dawn will recognize what I'm wearing and what I'm portraying today. I am dressed as a British soldier during the Anglo Zulu War of the 24th Regiment of Foot, 2nd Warwickshire. And these are the soldiers who took part in the famous battles at Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift. So the first thing I noticed, and I'm sure the soldiers of the 24th would have noticed, is like so many of these hikes into histories, the uniforms are not meant for the climate in which they're being worn. In this case, it's Texas, even in February, which is still quite warm. And it would have been similar for the soldiers of the 24th Regiment of Foot because they would have been in southern Africa, Natal, and by all accounts in 1879 it was an incredibly hot summer. So this serge wool uniform is definitely uncomfortable. It's high-necked, it holds heat. I mean, about the only part of it that works out pretty well is the foreign service helmet, which unlike, say, the kepe of the American Civil War and other wars of this period, at least this is not made of wool and it's not trapping heat on my head, or at least not quite as bad as the kepe would. So if you're a fan of the film Zulu with Michael Caine, you might be wondering why I'm not wearing this helmet. This is the official foreign service helmet that should have been worn by the 24th Regiment of Foot, complete with a golden badge emblem like they wear in the film Zulu. And the reason I'm not wearing this is because the real soldiers of the 24th Regiment of Foot didn't want to be shot. Yeah, do I really want to be wearing a blindingly white helmet, complete with a shiny, reflective gold badge in the shape of a crosshair right over my skull? And the answer is no. No, you wouldn't. So soldiers of the 24th Regiment of Foot and others serving in the Anglo Zulu War would have taken their foreign service helmet and they would have dyed it with teas or coffees, and you would have gotten this look. And they would have removed the badge and been a lot less conspicuous. You know, the Anglo Zulu War is really, I feel like, a transitional period. It's a transition from the equipment, the tactics, the weapons, the uniforms of the Napoleonic armies into the equipment, the tactics, the weapons, the uniforms of the modern armies of, say, the First World War and later. And I think nothing really says that or shows that better than how I am wearing this particular set of equipment. So what you're seeing here, I'm carrying this equipment in what is called field kit, or battle kit. This is how the soldiers at Rorke's Drift or Isandlwana would have carried their gear. And it would be very familiar to, say, reenactors of the American Civil War, because you have things slung across your shoulders and then essentially the weight is held up and distributed by a belt. And even the layout is very, very similar. You've got a haversack where you're keeping your personal possessions, maybe some extra rounds of ammo. You have cartridge belts. You have a canteen, and all of it is essentially slung across your shoulders and then held up by a belt. And this is the battle kit. This is what you're wearing going into battle. Now, I call this a transitional period because this is not everything a British soldier would wear. A soldier during the Anglo Zulu War wouldn't just wear this field kit all the time. He would also wear marching kit. And the marching kit is where you really start to see the transition, because it incorporates what can only be called kind of proto-webbing, the system that's very much like braces that World War I, World War II soldiers use, that comes over each shoulder, ties onto the belt forward and back, and then everything is suspended from that webbing and it distributes the weight much better. I'm not wearing it now because I'm in field kit, but in marching kit, I would have that white leather webbing from which I would suspend my mess kit and my greatcoat. Soldiers at Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift are wearing only their field kit because their gear is either in tents or packed onto wagons. It was really a very ponderous train of supplies, and the soldiers really weren't bearing most of it. And for that alone, I'm actually glad that I get to wear the field kit of the British soldier and not the marching kit. So you might have noticed the badges on my collar. They're in the shape of a sphinx, which was the emblem of the 24th Regiment of Foot from a prior posting in, you guessed it, Egypt. And really, the whole uniform has so many throwbacks to, uniforms during the Napoleonic era, and even back into colonial times. The facings that were regimental colors, in this case green, the lacings on my sleeves, just all this is really calling back to an older time. And in fact, this is going to be one of the last times the British Army goes into the field as a redcoat army. So the British Army has the reputation, especially in American media, of being very, very clean-cut, very disciplined, very squared away. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is American media, and it's always shown as a counterpoint to the Americans, who are slovenly and unkempt, but they have the skills necessary to win the war. It's always kind of slightly condescending toward the British, that they know how to dress but didn't know how to fight, and that's why we win the American Revolution, which is many, many levels of untrue. But the stereotype is in itself inaccurate, because the British soldiers in Natal would have been issued new equipment once a year in April. And until that time rolled around, they had to make do with what they had. Shoes, this was especially a problem with shoes. Shoe leather would just wear down. Uniforms would need to be patched, and the colors would be incredibly faded. So those who go into looking at the Anglo Zulu War, really kind of going, well, God, they're wearing red uniforms, they must stand out. Yes. But also, the uniforms would have been incredibly faded, almost to like a burnt orange, even brownish, rustus, and against dried grasses and the brown of a countryside that, until that point in January of '79, was really kind of suffering a drought up until about a few weeks prior to the battles of Isla Nuana and Rook's Drift. You would not have been as conspicuous as an armchair soldier might think. So those red uniforms, another thing about them, they've inspired a term that has come down to us even today, especially amongst the British Armed Forces, which is the term of calling essentially a new soldier a red ass. What does that mean? Well, the dyes used in the coats for the enlisted men were so cheap, they would run, and the dye would stain the rump region of a new soldier, and that's how you could identify a rookie soldier. He was a red ass. So this is a good time to talk about another transitional piece of equipment used by the British soldiers during the Anglo Zulu War, and that would be the Martini Henry Mark II. Now, the Martini Henry, I always thought, as kind of an American boy growing up, that the Martini Henry always just looked unfinished. There was something ungainly, mostly because in weapons of this period, you're used to these giant levers, John Wayne style levers, and it's just is a very sharp, clean look. Now, as an older man, I'm very taken with the Martini Henry. And this, of course, has the reputation as the weapon of the British colonial wars. I call the Martini Henry a transitional weapon because the transition finally from the percussion cap, Napoleonic style, Civil War style firearm, single shot muzzleloader into a breech loading system. And it's a transition before we hit the Lee Enfields of World War I and the weapons of World War II. So it's still single shot, but it is definitely a cleaner, simpler system, much faster than a muzzleloader. The story of the adoption of the Martini Henry is an interesting one because the British government put out essentially a call to arms makers to produce a next level weapon. And they didn't really like any of them, but they liked pieces of them. They liked pieces. They liked a barrel from one manufacturer, and they liked the action from another. And so that's where you get the Martini Henry. There is a hyphen there because it's a hyphenated weapon. It's the barrel from one maker and the action from another kind of welded together into one firearm. Now, the drawback to the Martini Henry actually has very little to do with the rifle itself. It's accurate at 400 yards, absolutely deadly. Theoretically, its range is more like 1,000, but for a typical British soldier, 400 yards, absolutely you're knocking down whatever you hit. The drawback is in the ammunition. Now, very early on, this is a big cartridge. This is the ammunition for a Martini Henry. Now, early on, this cartridge was made of rolled brass, incredibly thin. And when it came time to eject, if the rifle was too hot, well, you would literally, this would just stick into the barrel pieces. The rim would get torn away by the ejector. Now, it's lucky that this is a transitional weapon because you might have noticed it still has the ramrod from the earlier, Napoleonic and Civil War style weapons. So you draw the ramrod, run it down the barrel, the cartridge would pop out, but certainly, it takes some time. But there's also a problem inside these cartridges. The powder is incredibly coarse. It causes a massive kick. When you talk about the Martini Henry, the soldier memoirs talk about this thing would take your shoulder off. And it's mostly due to the powder of what they're firing. It would foul the barrel incredibly quickly. The barrel will get incredibly hot to, even like a dozen shots. You couldn't hold the barrel in order to aim. So soldiers in the Anglo Zulu War, I don't have one here, they would take cowhide and wrap it around the edge. And that was the most common modification to the Martini Henry to make it a more effective weapon. Now, at the Battle of Isandlwana and at the Battle of Rorke's Drift, where they're not super prepared for the battle that's coming, most of what they're carrying on their person would have been ammunition. You noticed I have the 2 white leather ammunition pouches. I also have dangling beneath one of those white leather pouches is a softer black leather reserve pouch, and that is for essentially extra ammunition, loose ammunition, especially ammunition that wasn't already a part of essentially an ammunition box that was being handed out by the quartermaster. They would also carry as much ammunition as they can in their haversacks. Haversacks throughout time are essentially used for soldiers' food, and they're essentially their daily needs that have nothing to do with war. But going into this battle of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, most of them weren't carrying bites of hardtack. They were carrying ammunition in their haversacks. There's one of the things I learned early on with this fuel kit system, and it was when I was wearing American Civil War gear, is please don't make the mistake of securing your canteen belt underneath anything else, because you're going to want to get to your canteen. A canteen of a Zulu war soldier, which I actually always enjoyed the look of it, but you unscrew the lid, which is not attached, and you have just essentially a beeswax lining to essentially just a wooden canteen. These weren't especially popular with the soldiers, and it's actually funny how often during wars you find out that the canteens especially are not popular with soldiers. And there was a secondary item that was used especially by officers, so they didn't have to use these canteens, which, being wood, they were not easy to clean out. They really didn't hold, coolness very well. So you're drinking hot water, no fun. Just like American Civil War soldiers, drinking out of the kind of those steel canteens, those tin canteens, and they heat up, whereas Confederate soldiers were very quickly starting to use gourds or things that would retain their temperature and not be like swallowing a pit of fire. The alternative to the traditional issue canteen was the soda pop bottle. Yeah, and you heard that right. It's made of glass and leather, and it was meant to hold essentially a carbonated beverage. But they found out that it held its temperature fairly well. It was easier to clean, and this was carried by quite a few troopers, but definitely officers in addition to their canteens or to replace their canteens, because they simply felt that it was just better. So, the soda pop bottle. So many of these hikes into history are essentially just boyhood fantasies, role play. As a friend of mine once said, how long have you like to play dress up? And yeah, this is definitely one of them. Going back to when I saw, Stanley Baker and Michael Caine in Zulu, I've always wanted to wear the gear of a Anglo Zulu war soldier, and now I have.